Welcome back to Finding a Fourth, your home for all things Commander. I'm Peyton, and around here we celebrate the politics, power plays, and legendary moments that make Commander the best format in Magic. Today we're going to be diving into Firelord Azula. It is a deck that I've built, had multiple iterations of so far, and this is the version I'm most happy with, and I think it's the most fun. I don't want to say the most balanced, because I think Azula is just really strong, but it's like the most fair version I could get, so it wasn't just trying to like immediately win on turn 5. Which was kind of the thought process before. So this version is a little cooler, a little less reliant on things like flash enablers, because I think those are kind of pitfalls for the deck. So let's talk about it. First off, we're going to talk about Firelord Azula herself. Before we get into it, I just want to shout out my altar that I got done. I recently commissioned an altar from jwiprialters on Instagram. I will link that below. If you're interested, I highly recommend. Phenomenal work. Check out their other altars as well, because they're all really good. But you'll see Azula here off to the left, right? I don't even know. I'm not good at telling directions. So that aside, I think Azula is just really strong. There's no quote-unquote fair version. I know that's what I kind of called this deck originally, but I just mean, like, there's no way to build like a bracket 2 version of Azula. I think it's impossible. Just too strong of a commander. You have to kind of remove her, because I think with her out on the battlefield, she's going to get value, and you're eventually going to get outvalued if you just let her live forever. The issue is that when everyone's playing strong commanders, like, how do you determine who to remove? So that's kind of where the deck lies, is it wants to kind of play not low to the ground, but you just kind of want to be sly and tricksy and kind of do things secretly. You know, you don't want to show your hand immediately. It's why we're going to be relying on a lot of flash and instant speed spells, because we want to kind of be secret and do things suddenly and scarily. And I really wanted to focus and lean in on the firebending part of Azula. I know, like, firebending 2 doesn't feel as impactful as, say, Firelord Zuko, who can get his to like 10, 12, crazy numbers during a game. But I really wanted to focus in and use her mana as kind of like the idea of like using it as a reduction. So instead of it just saying generate 2 mana when she attacks, it's kind of like thinking of it as like the first spell you cost during combat cost 2 red less. So a lot of our spells, if they cost 4 mana, they're only technically 2 mana. If they're 2 mana, they're free. If they're 1 mana in a color that isn't red, it's at just that color, whatever the case may be. I was just really trying to find impactful ways to use the firebending mana, and I just kind of landed on this idea that you can just use it to make our spells cheaper. So we're not too worried about playing on curve, because Azula kind of breaks our curve a little bit, because it's not forever mana, right? It's not every time we cast a spell it costs 2 less, but it is just the first one that we cast is really 2 less, and sometimes that means free, which is great, because those cards will generate mana, or those cards will generate card draw that also break their parity as well. So it's not just drawing 1 card, it's drawing 2, it's drawing 3, it's drawing 4, whatever the case may be. So we're looking kind of at, like I said, operating at instant and flash speed, which kind of leans itself into Grixis control. And I put control in quotations here because it's not like we're playing a control deck. We're not looking at stopping all of our opponents. We're not looking at really stopping everything at the table. We're not playing a true control deck, but it is kind of like a control deck, because we're always going to be casting stuff in response to our opponents, or trying to, at least. It isn't, not everything requires a response, but if we need to, we can, because so many of our spells are instant or flash speed. And I also put combat tricks in quotations as well, because again, it's not necessarily combat tricks traditionally. We're not looking at flashing out a spell that will pump Azula at instant speed and be like, surprise, now you're taking lethal commander damage. It's more just like, we're always going to be casting spells in combat, because that's what Azula wants us to do. So it is kind of like combat tricks, but it's not traditional like, ooh, you're dead here combat tricks. I did also really want to find a lot of spells that I could use for different purposes. So some of them I'm going to be wanting to cast in combat to get great effects when they're copied, but other times I'm going to be using them to just stop an opponent, or to remove a piece that they're going to try to win with or something. And I loved using kind of modal spells and the spree spell that's in here in that way. So you're not really limited to just always casting things during combat. or limited to using them as control pieces. You can kind of use them as needed when you draw them, or if you draw them at the right time. Maybe if you need card draw, you use the card draw mode instead of the, counter the spell mode, for example. I do want to shout out here we are not using any flash enablers. I think it is a pitfall for Azula at the moment. I think all of the flash enabler, not all of them, most of the flash enablers that you can run in Azula are like 4 mana. So they're competing with Azula as in terms of like when you're casting them. The one that I think people always are like, oh, I'm running it because it could be free, is the Leyline Anticipation, because it's like, oh, it's a free spell in my opening hand, and it's like, great. It's probably going to be a free spell like 2 out of every 10 games, if that. So it's like, is it worth it? Because if you don't have it in your opening hand and then you draw it later, it's almost a dead draw, because it's like, okay, well, I'd rather be casting Azula on turn 3 or 4, depending on how you ramp. And if I cast the Flash Enabler instead, and then I cast this, but then if I cast Azula and then cast the Flash Enabler, I'm not benefiting from her combat trick, which means she has to survive like a whole nother turn cycle. And I don't think it's a great way to build the deck. I think there are plenty of really, really good spells that already have Flash and or are instants. We don't really need to be giving a ton of the non-instant, non-Flash spells Flash speed. I think it's tempting because I think it is cool when people can like flash out our mana rocks, flash out Soul Ring, because it's like, oh, now I have 2 Soul Rings, and like you just ramp into oblivion with things like that. But it's such a situational thing, and there are just enough flash enablers to make it feel like it's something you can do. But again, like most of them cost so much that it's just like, okay, now what are we doing? We're operating at like a turn 6 or 7 deck, which is just too slow for Azula. Azula wants to really be getting out there early, getting a combat in early, so you can start getting value before your opponents. Because I think if you wait till turn 6 or 7 to start really doing your thing, you're already outpaced by like the green decks, more likely, because they've generated probably 10 mana by turn 6. You're getting outpaced by like is it Spellslinger deck, because they've already started slinging spells by turn 6 or 7. So I don't love the flash enablers. I think it's a pitfall. So to address the meme, the winning on turn 5, I don't need it. It is it's very easy to do that. If you play Azula on turn 4, get her to turn 5, swing out. I had a version of the deck that was basically guaranteed to win because of the way that you can tripped out. Basically, you're using all the spells that draw a card, replace themselves, and then you have some sort of like mana generator on top of that. So it's like a guaranteed win on turn 5. I don't love those builds. It's really fun and it's really strong, and I'm sure there are versions that do that really consistently, but it's not fun for the play group. People don't like to do that. And then it's also like all in on Azula. So if you're relying very heavily on Azula because she will inevitably be removed, you're not going to have anything to do in the deck. You're just going to be cantripping for no reason, I guess. And without Azula, you don't make copies, so you don't cantrip as well. So it's just, I wanted to find a version that could work without Azula. So we'll talk about some pros and cons. I think the biggest pro is that you actually have access to some of the best cards in the format. This is true for CDH as well as casual. CDH more so. You can put any commander at the helm of like a Grixis core and do really well. This is the same for Azula. Even in casual, just Grixis is really strong. You have access to some of the best card draw. You have access to some really great rituals. You have access to black tutors if you want. I'm not currently running the like obvious tutors, so like demonic and vampiric tutor are not in the deck. I'm running more specific ones for like instant and flash cards, just because they synergize here. But yeah, it's a strong color combination, and Azula is going to benefit from that. I think every Grixis commander benefits from this because it's just really strong, and it's almost hard to build a bad Grixis deck. I love that the deck doesn't require a ton of setup either. You can sometimes just do Azula with a bunch of mana and do really, really well. You don't need like other pieces the way that other decks do. Obviously, without Azula, the deck will be a little bit weaker, and that's one of the cons here. The deck will struggle more without Azula. It can be done. You can still win games without her, but the deck looks much better with her out on the battlefield. And Since we can operate at instant speed, it gives us such a huge advantage. I think instant speed is something that a lot of new players struggle with at first, because it's just like, I don't know when to cast things. It's I'm like, you'll see this a lot with new players where they'll cast the Path to Exile like on their turn on their main phase because they just want to remove a threat on the board. When in reality, you always want to be saving it for like a key moment. You want to let your opponent deploy resources and then remove something, so that those resources go to waste, instead of just removing something and then they just get to recast that thing, or they get to replay something else that will help that commander as well. So whatever the case may be. So I think once you understand instant speed, it's really, really strong. It lets you cast things on your opponent's end steps after they've wasted all their resources, so you're not worried about a counter spell. You can cast things in response to things, so that way you can dodge board wipes, or maybe you want to, you know, your things will die on the board wipe, but okay, then I'm going to be able to get value because I'm going to cast something that benefits from things dying at instant speed or something, whatever the case may be. In this deck, most of our instant speed is used as like protection, and or like, again, in response to what our opponents are doing. We're running some game changers that are going to definitely hurt our opponents and punish our opponents for doing things they're going to want to be doing, and that's kind of where I like the deck to be. I want us to be, again, in that pseudo control environment where our opponents are going to want to be casting things to get ahead, and we're going to punish them for that. The cons of the deck, we kind of went over one already, which is that Azula is a key part of our strategy, and so because our opponents will know that, they're also going to want to remove Azula. She is going to be a target for removal. There's no way around that. You're not going to be able to politic your way out of Azula being removed, so I think you just have to lean into like a lot of protection for her. I'm running a lot of protection. We'll kind of go over that when we go over the interaction part of the deck, but a lot of the deck is focused on like trying to protect Azula, to give her any amount of like ward, evasion, shroud, Malakir Rebirth is another one. Again, we'll talk about it more specifically, but just other effects to really protect her outside of just counter magic, because I didn't want to rely too much on counter magic, because then we would just become like a pure control deck, and that can be kind of hard because we also need Azula to be able to do other stuff as well. The other really big thing about the deck is that it is potentially mana hungry. It can be hard to just use her firebending mana to kind of bridge that gap, but eventually if you want to be able to multi-spell, you're going to need a lot of mana, and so managing resources is really key. In the same vein as like a control deck does, you can't always tap out on your turn, because then that means we have no mana left up to interact with the board or play our, again, like pseudo controlled kind of style. So it's going to require a lot of game knowledge, a lot of understanding the game to know like, okay, can I tap out here? Okay, if I don't tap out and I leave this counter spell up, like what am I looking to counter? Is my opponent about to win? If so, then I need to keep up this counter spell. Is my opponent going to try to deploy something that I can potentially punish, like with one of my game changers, or, you know, any of those things? So again, I think this deck does require a little bit of game knowledge. It's not necessarily beginner friendly, which is great, because I think a deck that really challenges experienced players to really know the game is a lot of fun to play, and I think Azula is just naturally one of those commanders. And so we'll dive into the interaction here, because I think this is kind of the, again, pseudo control version of the deck, in that we're going to really be responding a lot to what our opponents are going to try to do. Outside of like, I'm running 3 or 4 counter spells that are pretty basic, like non-modal, just straight up counter spells. And that's just because we will be having to just outright stop things that are either coming for Azula or outright stop opponents' win con. So I am running a lot on, I am running 4 of just like raw counter spells, but the reason for that is because sometimes we just won't have a ton of mana left over after we maybe deploy some of our own value pieces during combat. So I'm running 1 free counter spell with Force of Negation. Other ones are just 1 to 2 mana. And this is where like the modal spells come into play. So like 3 Steps Ahead, Sink into Stupor, Untimely Malfunction. These are all pieces that we can doubly use in combat or out of combat. So we can keep it up to potentially protect Azula, because we can change the target of a spell or ability, you know, punish our opponents, try to remove Azula by removing one of their pieces, or we can use it in combat to make up to 4 things. It can make 4 things not be able to block, so that lets us get Azula in if she needs to get in, if we don't have any other form of evasion for her, or we can destroy opponents' artifacts. If they've got like really key strong artifacts that they want to keep up, we can destroy 2 of them in combat. And we're also looking at like Malakir Rebirth. We talked about it before. Malekith Rebirth is great because it will kind of give us low mana options of protecting Azula, but this is great against like board wipes, because if we don't have a counterspell for a board wipe, something like Untimely Malfunction, Redirect Lightning are not really going to work because they're not single targeting Azula. And so instead, Malekith Rebirth will let us dodge a board wipe if we need to. And I think that's really great because board wipes are... Sometimes we want board wipes to go off because our opponents also have powerful creatures, but it's like, if I lose Azula here, I'm going to be set back so far. But Malekith Rebirth lets all of our opponents' things die, and we still get Azula. So it's kind of a win-win. Malekith Rebirth is a great card. I wish I played it more, to be honest, but I don't play a ton of black, which is probably why I don't get to use it often, but I think it's one of those cool cards that just says, like, hey, your stuff is still going to die, but mine won't. Because that's kind of the problem with countering board wipes at times, is it does stop your opponents from also getting their boards wiped, and sometimes it's like, well, I do want this board wipe to go off, so well, now we get to kind of have our cake and eat it too. Our ramp is kind of typical for a Grixis deck. We're running all of the talismans / signets that we can, because those are the ones that are 2 mana, so we can deploy it turn 2, get Azula out turn 3, a whole turn early, which is perfect for us. We're also using a lot of I say a lot of rituals. I think I'm only running 2, but we're running 2 rituals at instant speed, and this is perfect because these are copyable with Azula, which means that we get 6 mana between these 2 rituals. So if we keep this in hand and kind of hold it for when we're really trying to pop off, it's perfect because it just generates so much mana for us that we should be able to not necessarily win on the spot. There's no like one card in the deck that's going to just like win, but at least for us, this will propel our game forward by a ton, because generating 6 mana off of 1 spell is just really, really nice. And Cunning Nightbonder is another great shout out for this deck specifically, because we have so many spells with flash, and because it has flash itself, we're able to flash this out during combat, get 2 of them. That's 2 reduction on all of our spells, which is really, really nice. I haven't done the math exactly. I don't know exactly how many spells have flash, so maybe this isn't really like as great of a thing as I think, but every time I've had it, I've always been like, wow, this is actually doing a lot of work for me. It's reducing a lot of my spells by a lot. It reduces Hullbreaker Horror to like a reasonable amount of mana. It reduces Fairy Mastermind to just 1 mana. It reduces Orcish Bowmaster to 1 mana. It's just so many of our key pieces have flash, so it's a great way to reduce the spells by a lot. And then Nightscape Familiar is great because it gives us reduction on basically every spell in the deck. There are not a ton of black spells in the deck, and the ones that we are running, they're not super expensive, so this is really just a reduction on pretty much every spell in the deck except for our colorless and black spells. Now we'll go in on the draw part of the deck, which I think is where the deck is at its best. I think this is the strongest part of Azula's abilities, because there are so many instant speed draw spells that we can abuse because they get copied during combat. So the shoutouts for like the 2 mana free quote unquote spells are Demand Answers, Thrill of Possibility, and Sazakap's Brew. Those are all 2 mana draw 2 cards kind of effects. They do require us to discard cards, but because we only have to pay that one time, it's not a huge downside. So pitch 1 card, draw 4 cards for essentially free is a really, 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 really broken rate. And I think it's really cool because it just turns in... Azula really benefits from, again, we'll talk about kind of the game plan later, about the ideas that we're digging for like our key win cons here. And so even if we don't see them in our opening hand, sometimes we just need a Demand Answers and we draw enough cards to get into it. Big Score is basically this plus the ramp. So same thing, we'll discard a card, draw 4 cards, create 4 treasures. It basically pays for itself because it costs 4 mana. So again, a cantrip, if you will. And so it's perfect in Azula. It will essentially cost 2 less with her mana. So you're paying 2 mana to draw 4 and create 4 treasures. So we can storm off into something else, flash out another piece, flash out another draw spell if we need to. Wanshing Tongue is another great kind of draw piece because we can either flash them out early in response to somebody like searching their library through like ramping or a fetch land, and we can get incremental card draw over the course of the game. Or if we cast him later, we essentially get double the draw, because if we save him for combat, we'll get an extra 2 mana with Azula, flash him out during combat. The 2 versions of him will still ETB. One will die to the legend rule, but we still get his ETB trigger to draw the half X cards, which with 2 versions of him will basically be like the full amount of X. So if we dump 5 mana into the X, we'll actually draw 5 whole cards. Actually, I don't think we will, because it's half rounded down. Half of 5 will be 2. We'll only draw 4 cards. But still, you're basically getting the full rate. So if you could cast him for like 10, you're having it to 5. Both versions will draw 5. You'll draw 10 cards. So it's just a great late game draw spell or an early game kind of value piece to draw incrementally. He's a great attacker because he has vigilance. So he just slowly grows over the course of a game, and you have pressure in the air for your opponents. And Securian Infiltrator I will shout out as a really, really underrated card, I think, because in Azula, the way that squad works, the copy of Securian Infiltrator will see however many times you paid into the squad cost. So if you're able to cast, let's say, like a Dark Ritual, so we spend, and again, this is like the great part of like using Azula's firebending mana. If we think about the firebending mana for Securian Infiltrator, that means it costs 1 blue. Then we use 1 black to generate 6 black mana. We dump all 6 of that black mana into the squad of Securian Infiltrator. That means that we get 2 copies of Securian Infiltrator that have both been squatted 3 times, which means when both copies ETB, they will both create 3 copies for squad. And that means we draw a version, or that means we draw a card for each version that we got. So you'll draw 8 cards because there are 8 Securian Infiltrators entering the battlefield, 2 quote-unquote originals, and 3 copies per original. So crazy rate. I think Offspring works in the same way because it is like an additional, not an additional cost, but it's like, because it is an additional cost, the copy of the spell will see that that additional cost was paid. It's not, that's the kind of the confusing part of Magic, is that not every card works that way. Just because you copy a spell doesn't always mean you get like the additional benefit. But it's the same reason why like this also gets copied, the additional cost for something like Demand Answers. You only have to pay the additional cost on the original spell, not for the copy as well. And so Securian Infiltrator works the same way. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you may pay 2 any number of times. When the creature enters battlefield, create that many token copies of it. So again, it's just a super broken card. You can draw insane amounts of cards for very little mana. Again, I explained a scenario that you only spend 2 mana to get 8 bodies and draw 8 cards. Super broken. Again, it's technically not only 2 mana because you are using the 2 firebending mana from Azula, but like I said, if you always think of that 2 mana as just a reduction, it really elevates the power of that mana, I think. Now we'll talk about the game plan. This is kind of the quintessential, like what we're going to be doing every single game. We're going to be looking to ramp on turn 2. That is the best start to the deck we can have, and that's just because we want to be able to either get Azula out early or get Azula out with some protection, because we don't want to just be casting Azula. We don't want to be playing a land a turn, turn 4, cast Azula. Now we have no mana left, and we pass the turn and just fingers crossed hope Azula makes it to the next turn cycle, because opponents are not going to want to let her live if they can remove her, so they will remove her. So ideally you want to ramp so you can either get her out a turn early, which means our opponents have maybe tapped out, and that we can safely deploy her without having to worry about a counterspell. And then maybe people are still going to want to be building their board states, so you're like a little safer to deploy Azula that early. Or we can deploy her on turn 4, but with 1 extra mana, so we have something like a protection spell up, one of our 1 mana protection spells. So we ramp, we get Azula out. Once Azula is out, it's just about protecting Azula. You're not going to be able to politic your way out of removal in Azula, so I think the best case scenario is just to try to lay low. I think it's kind of hard because you are playing Azula. People are not going to... You could be as low to the ground as possible and people are going to potentially just remove her, and that it just is what it is. You have to kind of accept that you're playing a strong commander, but I just play a little control-y and then keep opponents in check and kind of just play a little bit more low to the ground, and I think you'll be surprised that that works so often. I think sometimes the loudest player, the player that draws the most attention to themselves, will sometimes eat removal just because they're the loudest player. If someone has a removal spell and they kind of try to gauge the table's reaction to like what should be removed, and somebody immediately is like, don't remove Azula, I'm not going to do anything on my turn. Don't remove Azula, like I'm not going to do anything on my turn, blah, 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 blah. That kind of reaction sometimes will be like, I'm going to remove Azula, like you're so passionate about her, like I'm not convinced you're not going to do anything. And so sometimes I think you just have to kind of play it chill, play it a little, if someone wants to remove a piece, just stay quiet. Don't say anything. Don't offer up another opponent's thing, because I think when you say, oh, remove, I don't, let's say our opponent's playing, Magus Lucia Kane, like, oh, remove Magus Lucia Kane, she's stronger, because then that Magus Lucia Kane player is going to be like, oh, remove Azula, she is dangerous. Like, just stay quiet, lay low. If somebody says like, hey, I think we should remove Azula, like, she seems really strong, they're about to untap and go to combat and potentially, copy some dangerous spells, you could just be like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what the deck does, if that's what you want to do. And I think when you play a little bit more coy, play a little bit more sly like that, people, again, you're not looking to necessarily mislead your opponents. I don't like to ever do that. I don't like to ever lie and say like, oh, I'm not going to do anything on my turn, because if I do something on my turn, it feels a little disingenuous. Instead, I'm just going to be like, obviously, if I get to untap with Azula, I'm going to go to combat. I'm going to swing with her. I'm going to be casting a spell. It may be good. It may not be. That's for you to decide and figure out. And sometimes it's just better, especially if you've deployed Azula into a board state where maybe your opponents have strong things as well. You can feel a little bit safer and feel a little bit more coy, kind of being like, okay, maybe there's another thing at the table that's worth removing, So that's kind of what I do. Again, Azula's strong. There's no way around it. I don't think you're going to be able to say like, hey, Azula's the only thing on the table, don't remove her. Like, obviously, if she's there and someone has removal, you might just eat it, and it is what it is. We potentially have ways to protect her then, because that's kind of the threat you're going to kind of pose. I wouldn't necessarily disclose that information immediately, like, hey, if you try to remove Azula, I'm just going to counter it. But you could do that. You could say like, an opponent is like, hey, I have a Path to Exile, like, what should I remove? You can just be like, well, I've got a counter spell, so if you come at Azula, I'll just counter it, so you might as well send it to a creature that's actually going to get removed. It's a little bold, and some people may call your bluff, and if you have to eat the counter spell, or use the counter spell, just so people know that you're serious, then you do have to, and that is what it is. But a lot of times opponents love the idea that like their spell will resolve, so if you even just threaten the counter spell, you don't even have to actually cast it, you just threaten the counter spell. And sometimes you can even be so bold as to show it, just like show the counter spell in hand, like you have their cards in hand, just be like, oh, I've got this one song, so if you throw the path my way, like I'll counter it. And then opponent's like, oh, well, I want to remove something, there's multiple threats on the board, so if I guarantee to remove this, then yeah, I'd rather use the path on that. So you can, again, be very smart and tricksy in Azula. Again, Azula is smart and tricksy in the show, so you kind of have to play like she would. Once we've kind of protected Azula, and once we've maybe dodged a few removal spells, the goal is to just sculpt a hand. I use the word subtly here, but it's going to be kind of hard to subtly draw 4 cards. But the idea is that you're using her ability to draw out of parity. You're using her ability to cast spells that you shouldn't normally be able to cast, get copies of spells, so you're getting multiple different advantages from just one card. But ideally, we're trying to sculpt a winning hand, because we're going to try to wait for our window to really have an explosive turn / combat. Sometimes that's the joy of benefiting from instant speed, is that we can kind of win on top of opponents or win on top of people trying to stop us in some instances. So once we go over the win cons, I'll kind of explain what that looks like and what that might mean. But that's kind of the game plan overall, is we're really looking for like one explosive turn. So we're going to be spending the not winning turns just sculpting that hand. But before we talk about the win cons, we're kind of going to go over some key pieces. And these are kind of cards that I don't think necessarily qualify as win cons. They certainly could be, or certainly can propel us into a game winning state, but they're not necessarily just outright win cons. The first one is Vivi's Persistence. I think this card was made for Azula. I don't know, maybe they accidentally printed it in the Final Fantasy scene box instead of in a Azula scene box or something, because it feels like it should just be Azula's Persistence with how perfectly it fits into our plan. But for everyone that doesn't know, these scene box cards are kind of sometimes under the radar cards, because they don't get mass printed, and because a lot of people don't see the value in necessarily buying a whole scene box for one card. And I think the single of this card is like pretty pricey, so like you might, if you find a scene box of this, just buy the scene box, because you end up getting like 5 other cards in addition to this one for like the price of just buying this as a single. So if you see the scene box, nab it up quick. I think this is a phenomenal card, probably even outside of Azula, but with Azula, it's too good. It is a 1 in a red for instant that you create a 0/1 black wizard creature token with whenever you cast a non-creature spell. This token deals 1 damage each opponent. Whenever your commander enters or attacks, you may pay 2. If you do, return this card from your graveyard to your hand. So that 2 mana, 1, it costs 1 in a red, which is perfect for our firebending mana. And then after that, whenever Azula attacks, she generates 2 mana again, which is the perfect amount of mana to buy this spell back from the graveyard to our hands. So it's too good. And obviously the first time we cast it, we get a copy of it. So that's 2 wizards. Then we buy it back to our hand, we cast it again. Now we're doing 2 damage each opponent, still creating 2 wizards. Next combat, buy it back, cast it again. Now that's 4 damage. It's too strong of a spell to not include in Azula. I don't like to use the word like auto-include, but I think this is one of those auto-includes in the deck. I think it's too good. She generates the perfect amount of mana to buy it back every turn, and it's really strong. It turns all of our wizards into a lot of damage, and I think it's really, really strong because, again, it's just, I hesitate to use the word auto include, but I think this is one of those cards that like you kind of have to include if you have one. I'm sure there are other decks that really benefit from it, but this just feels like it was made for Azula, and so I think everyone should be running it. I think it's a great card, and the wizards are so, again, I don't see a ton of people looking to remove the wizard tokens. If anything, they're going to remove Azula, but again, if we just recast it, we buy this back again, and we just start the whole process over again. So it's a super strong card. Hullbreaker Horror is kind of, I don't need to tell people it's a strong card, but I do have to shout it out as just one of our key cards in the deck, because if we manage to get this out during combat and we get 2 of them, we're guaranteed to just have the game unlock at that point, because every spell we cast after that is going to be us bouncing 2 things back to our opponent's hands, and eventually the boards are just going to be empty because we've bounced everything but the lands, and our opponents are going to be set so far behind, and even if they start redeploying things, we can cast spells to put those back in their hands again. So Hullbreaker Horror is just really strong. That's not news to anybody, but knowing that in Azula you can get 2 of them, it's too good. And I don't know the interactions. I know Hullbreaker Horror can combo off because of like certain spell, like you bounce certain spells, then you recast them and bounce. I don't think there's anything like that in this deck, at least not to my knowledge, and not intentionally so. But I think it's really broken because I think with 2 Hullbreaker Horrors out, if somebody casts a spell and then I flash out a spell at instant speed and I get 2 triggers, I think I can target both my spell and my opponent's spell, which is really broken because I can then return the spell that I used back to hand, so I can then use it again. I just keep doing that, which I think is really broken. And I think it's really broken with something like a deflecting swat, because if I can cast that for free, then essentially I just bounce it back to my hand for free, because you just want the cast trigger on the spell. You don't actually care that the spell is being, it's not having, the spell doesn't have to resolve in order to get the Hullbreaker Horror trigger. So it's like, I think it's super broken. I just said, like I said, I know Hullbreaker Horror is already a strong card, but just I think with 2 of them, it's like, it's crazy good. Surprise. No. And the last shout out would be the last Agni Kai. It's a risky spell because if Azula is your only creature, she has to survive 2 fights, which if your opponents don't have super small creatures, then you're not going to survive the 2 fights. So just be careful, but it's great if you can have like other creatures on board that will benefit from this. So like our Hullbreaker Horror is a great shout out. He'll generate us a ton of mana off the last Agni Kai, and because we're casting it during combat, we'll get 2 of them, which means we get 2 fights and all that extra mana. Sometimes you can just generate 6, 7, 8 mana off of 2 of them. We're not using too much of the last part of the spell, which is that the until end of turn you don't lose unspent red mana as steps in phase's end. It comes up situationally sometimes. I've had hands where I have like 2 of my talismans, and it's like, I really wish I could cast these, but I don't really want to spend all this mana and then go into combat with like not really an answer. But you can actually use the last Agni Kai, generate a bunch of mana, go to your second main phase with all that saved mana, and then redeploy like a bunch of mana dork, or not mana dorks, mana rocks and other kind of pieces that necessarily you don't worry about flashing out, and get value that way. So Last Night Nikai, great ritual, great piece of removal as well, so it's kind of pulling double duty in the deck. I love it a lot. Now we're going to go over the win cons, the most important part of the deck, and I have to start out with, I think, the strongest card in the deck, Fated Firepower. I think this is a super underrated card. I don't know if people are running a ton of it. I know that I'm running it in 2 of my decks, and in both decks it is absolutely the best card that I can use for those decks. I think both of the decks I use it in do copy it, so maybe that's like where it just gets infinitely better, but even I think just a single copy of this spell is just super game changing. Every source that you own does that extra damage, so even if you can only put like 5 into the X, everything that you do doing an extra 5 damage, right? It's not instead of doing whatever damage you do 5 instead, it's just additional to what you're doing. So if you cast a spell that does 10 damage, you're going to do 15 damage, right? And I know like the difference between 10 and 15 doesn't feel like a lot, but in a game of Commander, that can just be like the difference between killing an opponent and not killing an opponent, and I just think it's so worth it. And the fact that we can copy it in Azula is just, you are going to get value. If you can make X's 10, doing 20 extra damage on everything is like, again, you will be nuking the board in no time. And the cards that really benefit from something like a Fated Firepower are going to be our pingers, like VV, Longshot, our little 0-1 wizard tokens from VV's Persistence, Orcish Bowmasters, also another win con, but also another card that can benefit from Fated Firepower. We have a couple like raw damage spells. I think Delayed Blast Fireball comes to mind. That'll deal damage to each of our opponent's creatures and our opponents themselves. So sometimes if, you know, Fated Firepower is on 5, we're doing an extra 10 damage in addition to the 2. So that's 12 damage each opponent and 12 to each creature they control. If we cast it in combat, we're getting another copy, which means we're going to be dealing 24 damage to each opponent. See, like it's exponential every time. This is Fated Firepower plus our pingers plus our damage spells are too good. I don't need to tell people how good VV is. Obviously VV's good. He'll generate us mana and be a pinger. Longshot, similar situation. He's reducing our spells and he's pinging our opponents for a lot. So both great cards, both are good without Fated Firepower, and they just get infinitely better when we finally get that Fated Firepower. Invoke Calamity is a spell that lets us free cast up to 4 instant or sorceries from our graveyard and hand. This is really great because a lot of our spells are low costed, so we're able to get up to 4 spells on the stack. And because they are cast, they do trigger things like Longshot and VV, and so it can help us ping the table down, it can help us ping our opponent's creatures down, it can help us do whatever we need to do. Sometimes that means drawing more cards because Invoke Calamity lets us cast, and because they're cast, they trigger during Azula's combat, so they'll copy as well, which will, like, I think they get up to like 8 copies of spells on the stack, I think, if I'm correct, because of the way that it works. I put up to 4 spells on the stack because, again, technically, if you don't have enough spells to like trigger it, it won't be 8, but I think the maximum number you can get is 8 because of the way that the copies work and because they are cast without paying their mana cost. It just super broken. Whenever you start doubling things, the math gets hard. It's very, you're just like, I think I just copied the spell 8 times here, essentially, is what it feels like, and it's like, wow, it does that. Our next shout out is going to be Orcish Bowmasters, and I should have kind of put a little asterisk here of like any of the other game changers, just because game changers change games, but Orcish is our pinger, which is why it's more of our more of our win con than the other game changers. Our other game changers are going to be Notion Thief and Opposition Agent. Again, I just wanted all of our game changers to kind of be punishing for our opponents. But Orcish Bowmaster doubles as like a win con because, again, with things like Fated Firepower and just an Orcish Bowmaster by themselves is enough to finish games. It can ping our opponent's valuable creatures down, or it can just ping opponents to face. It also generates a big body that we can block with later, or potentially swing out with later if we need to. It's just one of those cards. We know it's good. I don't have to tell people that Orcish is good, but in this deck it's really good. The great thing about a lot of what we're doing here is we're not just looking to flash out Orcish Bowmaster during combat so we get 2 copies, because that's great, and having 2 Orcish Bowmasters is probably just so backbreaking for our opponents, but we don't necessarily have to do that. We can wait for our opponents to try to cast like a big draw spell, and then we just flash this out in response and do a bunch of surprise damage. So again, there's a lot of different ways to like play this deck. It's not just relying solely on doing everything during combat. That is a great way to do a lot of what we're trying to do, but we can also hold it back and again play a more control style and really pop off that way. And I think that's what makes the deck so good and so fun. And that's why without Azula, the deck can still kind of do what it wants to do. We can not have Azula on board and still be threatening with like an Orcish Bowmaster in hand, because our opponents are going to try to cast a big draw spell, and then we flash out this Orcish in response, and then it's like, okay, I'm going to do 20 damage to opponent this turn because my friend here wheeled, and it's great. We can respond at any point in time at instant speed. Like I said, I kind of talked about it earlier. If you have a Fated Firepower out and then somebody goes to like remove a creature to try to stop you from popping off, you can just flash out another spell to put another trigger of long shot on the stack, for example, or you can flash out another instant or sorcery to put another ping on the spell from VV or from our wizard tokens or whatever the case may be. And that's the power of operating instant speed, is it just gives us the ability to answer. And that's really just the strength of operating at instant speed, is that it gives us the ability to answer whatever our opponents want to do with another instance of like danger, so to speak, right? So if you don't play at instant speed often, or you don't necessarily think that playing at instant speed is really that strong, I highly recommend checking out a deck that is similar to this, or just checking out this deck in general, because you'll see the power of being able to respond to an opponent trying to stop you by just putting another activation or putting another spell on the stack that then threatens our opponent's life totals or threatens our opponent's board states, whatever the case may be. There's, I think out of the whole deck, there's only 4 sorceries off the top of my head. I should probably just look at the deck list, but there are, I think, 4 sorceries in the deck, and one of them can be cast at instant speed if it targets something you control, the flash photography spell, which is really cool. So a lot of the deck is just looking to be cast at instant speed or at flash speed or whatever you want to call it, because that's where the deck shines. I mean, any time we copy a spell, it just breaks that spell usually. There's very few instances where you're going to be getting 2 copies of a spell and thinking like, wow, this kind of sucks. So that kind of just brings us to the end. There's not much else to talk about. Again, you could probably switch out like all the game changers if you wanted to for cards that are not game changers, but the issue I have with that is that I think there is no version of this deck that looks like a bracket 2 deck. I think Azula is too strong and there's too much value in the text that she has to ever be a bracket 2. So I think even without 0 game changers, you're gonna have to tell people this is a bracket 3 deck. And if you're a bracket 3 deck, you might as well just run the 3 game changers, because you can. You could probably switch them out for like less impactful game changers if you want to try to alleviate some of that strength, but I don't think it's possible to build a bracket 2 Azula deck. And so maybe like a Fierce Guardianship, gamble, like Ancient Tomb version of the deck is probably as close as you'll get to like a fair version, but I have had versions in the past that operated a lot differently. I had a version that relied heavily on the flash enablers because I also fell into that pitfall early on. I realized the weakness in that deck. My second version was just to pop off. It was basically guaranteed to win if you let Azula do the thing, which is not a fun play pattern for me specifically. So this version I felt the most fair. Like I said, I don't think there's a version that looks quote unquote fair, but it's the most. Your opponents don't feel so much pressure with this one. Azula is still really strong and they're still going to be scared of the deck, but it's not just all right, I win here now deck the way that the previous versions I had were necessarily. So I hope you check this deck out, and I hope you like some of the choices I've made as far as like unconventional, maybe not true quote unquote unconventional, but maybe you'll check the deck list out and see some pieces that you're like, wow, I didn't think about that for Azula, but it looks really nice. And if you check it out, let me know, and just let me know what you think or what pieces for Azula you have that you like. So I just want to thank you for joining us on this Deck Tech on Finding a Fourth. And if you liked it, you can hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment about some of your favorite Azula cards, ones that I didn't include here. Maybe if you check the deck list and see cards that you think I should be running, let me know below, because I'm always looking to tweak the deck. I think this is one of those decks that you're always going to have to be able to tweak. And remember, whether you've got a full pod or you're still searching for that last player, you can always come hang out with us here at Finding a Fourth. Until next time.